We're in St. Augustine, Florida. This is the oldest continuously inhabited city that's still inhabited on the North American continent. The fort, originally built by the Spanish, was inhabited by the British and then the Americans. The exterior of the fort was surrounded by cannons. And here you can see one of the gun emplacements. They would swivel around. Must be the official crest of the crown. I'm always surprised you can get fresh water this close to the ocean. They are right on the beach. There was no living quarters per se in the fort. The men lived in town. They either brought their families with them or got married here. They would do a 24-hour stint at watching at the fort. When the British took over, they traded the fort for Cuba, or Havana anyway, and the harbor. They garrisoned troops here without families. And the chapel, of course. The religion was a large part of Spanish life. Used for displays now, about a fourth of the rooms were simply used for storage of dry goods, flour, that sort of thing. Fortunately, they had modern facilities. Actually, they had a self-flushing latrine. At high tide, the water would come in and wash the sewer pipes clean. The fort is made from coquita, C-O-Q-U-I-T-A, a form of limestone naturally made from sand and seashells. Or some of the material, I've forgotten which mineral, leaches from the shell and mixes with the sand and the other part of the shell, making a soft rock. It's actually very good for a fort because it absorbs the cannon balls that hit it rather than cracking and crumbling. The fort was never conquered in battle, although the English did try on several occasions, early 1700s, 1702, 1740, I think. It was ceded eventually by a trade with Cuba, as I mentioned, and eventually ceded to the Americans. During the Civil War, it passed back and forth a couple of times, but no battles. Basically just one army would leave and the other one would take over. We're in Seminole County, Florida, where we're going to go look for a big tree. And in Big Tree Park, we will find a tree called the Senator, a 3,500-year-old cypress tree. Now you can put that on pause if you want to read more about it. Now it was 165 feet tall until a hurricane knocked the top of it off. It's a little over 100 feet tall now. The Lady Liberty, another cypress. No sign telling us about it, but presumably it's not as old as the Senator. After a stop at the Visitors Center for Central Florida, we learned of a car show in Haines nearby. Looks to me like it's a bit of a flop, trying to rain, but there's a few cars here to take a look at. Benji's not too sure about the fake dog. Too scary for me. This one's entitled The Last Ride. Today we're near Lakeland, Florida, where we are supposed to see inside this building many different examples of experimental and home-built aircraft. Take a harder look at this. This, instead of having wheels, has hydro skis. No floats, but it's a seaplane. Problem is that this thing has to go at about 120 miles an hour to get airborne. And going through the seas, water, choppy water, at that rate of speed makes for a pretty rough ride. Nonetheless, they fiddle around with it from 51 to 57, trying to make it work. Now the docent says that every one of these aircraft have flown in their day. Propeller on top and the pilot down below. Now the docent did comment that some of these people had more guts than brains, but they all flew. They kept at it until it worked. Look at those little propellers, little one-cylinder engine. Take a little guy to fit into that cockpit. Just add wings. And here we have the back annex. One of the first VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Take off and land from its tail. Had two sets of props on the front there, one rotating in one direction and one in the other. This offset the twist so that the aircraft wouldn't twist. Now this looks like it started off as a standard rowboat. Instead of an outboard engine, they got a pusher engine on top. And yeah, that's a plastic chair sitting in the front of it. But every one of these things flew. Do any of you remember the old cars back in the 20s and the 30s? They would get old sitting around, the seats would wear out, and the stuffing would come out of them. Well, that stuffing you probably took a closer look at. It looked a little funny. It wasn't the stuff we had today, that's for sure. Well, it was this moss. This moss growing on the trees in the south. Ford employed a lot of people picking this moss for his cars. They gather it up and stuff it and send it north. We're stopping at the College of South Florida, I believe it is. Going down Frat Row here, where each of the frat dorms, I would call them, they're obviously built specifically for this purpose. They've painted their emblems, whatever you want to call it, on the street. We're in the campus of Florida Southern College because many of the major buildings were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Starting off with a fountain, which he called the dome, because if the water pressure is high enough, the water will meet at the top and create a dome-like effect. This is the library building. The geometric pattern is classic for Wright. It was built during World War II and it took several years for that reason. All of the buildings are connected by a walkway, a covered walkway, with these distinct pillars and a very low ceiling. I can easily reach up and touch the ceiling. This one's difficult to get an overall view of. It was originally designed as a cafeteria, considered one of his favorite because of the simplicity of the design. This is the chapel, also known as a bicycle rack because of the metalwork you see at the top, and also the bow tie building because of the indentations on the tower leading up to that metalwork. Another view of the chapel, and there are other buildings on campus that I haven't taken pictures of, including a planetarium, which was the only planetarium that he designed that was ever built.
We're at the Highlands Hammock State Park near Sebring, Florida, the very first Florida state park. A Florida hammock, a forest of broadleaf trees. I understand mostly palm and oak. Also a swampy area. Much of the sunlight does not make it to the ground. Alligators are present in this park. They are part of Florida's ecology. An oak tree in the park is said to be 1,000 years old. I hope Benji isn't alligator bait. Well, it may be 1,000 years old, but it's not getting older. But there has been some dirt collected at the top, and a couple of trees, including a palm tree, are growing up there. It's pretty overgrown with the trees, and then the palms at the bottom, and then of course even smaller stuff below that. It's said to resemble a subtropical jungle, but it's not that thick, in my opinion. A cypress swamp. Yes, it's swampy. Haven't seen any alligators yet. A cypress swamp gets its name from bald cypress trees, so-called bald because they lose their leaves in the wintertime.